So Lila and he had a few drinks and a salad, and Lila told him about her boyfriend and their problems. And then the phone rang, and it was she. She sounded a little drunk. They didn't show up, he thought, and she went to a bar and has had a few. And she started talking to him about the Chicago job offer. What should she do? Lila was right there in the room, a friend of his wife, and also of his, and she said she had to decide tomorrow. I can't really talk about this with you now, he said. Why don't you give me another call in an hour or so? He hung up, and Lila said, Who was that? He said, It's just someone who's going through some changes. Lila knew him well, and she gave him a funny look like, Oh yeah? Is that what it is? And they continued to talk. About 30 minutes later, he heard a heart-stopping sound, the buzzer from downstairs. She was showing up uninvited. So this was the kind of person she was. And Lila said, More career discussion? He gave Lila a look and walked over to the intercom. It was midnight. She was a little drunk. She said, Can I come up? I'm here. I want to talk to you. The doorman wasn't going to let her up until he said it was all right. He said, No, I'll come down. She laughed. Why do you have to come down? I'll come up. No, he said. Oh, is there someone there? Yes. I'll buzz you when it's time for you to come up. Then he went back in the living room. Lila, I don't know how to say this, but there's someone coming up now and you're going to have to leave. Lila said, I understand. It's all right. Lila left and he buzzed downstairs, and soon she was at the door. She walked in and said she hadn't really wanted to come and had been planning not to come. Here, look what I wore, this old dress. And he said, Well, here you are. He felt two things. This woman is not to be trusted. She's unreliable. She shows up at my apartment without an invitation. Does this mean when my wife is here, she'll call in the middle of the night because she has to talk to me? That she'll show up one day at a more inappropriate time than this? Does it mean she has a streak of rebelliousness, of indiscretion and manipulation? What will happen if something goes wrong in this relationship and it turns sour and ugly? What will she do? Will she arrive at work drunk and embarrass me? He was flashing on wonderful, horrible scenes of her storming drunkenly into his office and demanding that he continue to see her, threatening to call his wife, or calling him late at night and hanging up whenever Barbara answered, or stationing herself downstairs in the lobby of his apartment building and waiting for him. And while he walked out with Barbara one day, she'd come up and say, Look, I have to talk to you right now. And Barbara would think, Who the hell is this? Or she might start sending him things in the mail, angry postcards and threatening letters, or she would tell her boyfriend Jeremy about him, even lie about him, and Jeremy would try and get him in trouble at work, or hire people to beat him up. So on one hand, he was experiencing terrible paranoid fantasies, and on the other, he was thrilled she'd come over on her own without being invited. And he said, assuming a Socratic posture, Do you realize why I'm upset? Yes, because I came without calling. At least she understood, and right away he forgave her. They talked first about the job offer in Chicago. If she took it, it meant her relationship with Jeremy, the man she came to New York to live with, was really finished, and she felt ambivalent about it. They wanted her to start within 2 weeks. She had to call them the following day and tell them whether or not she would. She was panic-stricken because she had to make another life decision. Then she said there was another reason why she didn't want to go to Chicago. And he asked, What is it? She said, I don't want to talk about it. And he said, Is there another guy there? And she said, Not exactly. Anyway, I'm not ready to tell you about that now. Okay, let's forget about it. Let's put it behind us. Let's take tonight and make the most of it. So they had a drink. He smoked a joint. And they made love. And again she asked him repeatedly and obsessively, What do you want? What do you want? statues depicting men holding loaves of fishes or grasping shepherd's crooks or gathering sheaves. In the windows, St. Francis among the animals, St. Christopher comforting the solitary wayfarer, Jesus as a shepherd, a carpenter, a healer, a miracle worker, as the Prince of Heaven in glorious splendor, as a tormented mortal shouldering the sins of all humanity, as a babe in a manger, and in his passion on the cross. Laughing, the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth, half-naked, sweating, proud to be hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and freight handler to the nation. Finally, they fell asleep at around 6:30 in the morning. At 8, he got up. She looked beautiful, like a little sleeping child, the sun coming through the blinds, yellow and soft and pretty. He had to get to work, and he was not going to leave her alone in the house. He tried to wake her gently. She didn't respond. He took a shower, got dressed, and tried to wake her again. He was getting a little anxious. It was around 8:30, and finally he shook her and said, "Hey, come on, get up." She gave him a friendly but dirty look and whispered, "Let me sleep." He said, "I'm sorry, but we have to go. Come on." So she very sleepily, petulantly, got dressed, and then they went through the same routine about leaving. He opened the door, checked the hall. His next-door neighbors knew him and his wife well, and he didn't want them to see her walking out of his apartment at 9 in the morning. She stood there half asleep in a raincoat, hat, and glasses, and he gave her instructions. "Okay, this time I want you to walk out and turn right and go to West End Avenue and walk uptown, and I'll pick you up in a taxi." She gave him a look out of the corner of her eye, like, "Give me a break. What is this? You want me to walk left? You want me to walk right?" And he closed the door behind her, gave her 5 minutes, then walked down to West End Avenue. It was a wet, chilly, early spring morning. He had that wasted, burned-out, no-sleep feeling. He hailed a cab, and she was nowhere to be found. And he thought, "Oh God, that stupid bitch, she turned the wrong way." And they drove up and down West End Avenue, but couldn't find her. In the afternoon, he walked to a luncheonette on Broadway and 79th Street because he knew her apartment was 2 blocks from there. He called her from a pay phone and heard her boyfriend on his answering machine, in a heavy Australian accent, say, "This is Jeremy. I'm not home. Please leave a message after the tone." He was reluctant to say anything because he was afraid she wouldn't erase it, but he spoke anyway. "I'm at the corner 79th Street restaurant. I missed you. Where were you?" Then he hung up, and he ate some horrible greasy spoon food and went on with the rest of his day. Now she had 2 strikes against her, showing up at his house uninvited and either screwing up or deliberately not meeting him. That night, when she came to work again, they went through the same routine where they acted like colleagues. She was the last one to leave and walked by him on her way out. He said, "Come into my office." And they decided to go out for a drink. She admitted she'd been so annoyed about being awakened and being told what to do, she decided to walk the other way, and he liked her spirit. They went to a bar around the corner from his apartment. He was throwing caution to the wind, sitting with her at a table by the window for all the world to see. There was a jukebox and a little dance floor, and they went over and danced together. She moved well with him. She was so light, so graceful. Then they sat down, and he felt as if he was vibrating, as if she and he were imbued with light in the crowded room. And she said, "You know what I'd really like to do? I'd like to go out and have a real date tomorrow night, hit all the bars and clubs and hear music and really do the town." She was touching his foot with her foot, holding his hand. And he said, "I don't think I have the money. It'll set me back a couple of $100. Look, I have a credit card. Come on, what the hell? We can go Dutch. I'll pay my share." And he felt bad about it, but said, "Okay, I'll try to set something up." He put her in a taxi, and all Friday he made calls to restaurants and jazz clubs, and he lined up a whole evening for them. But she never called in the afternoon, and he stayed at work after everyone had left that night, and she never showed up and never called there either, and his heart was breaking. He went home and spent the night alone. The next day he called her from a phone booth in her neighborhood, not knowing what he would say. She picked up. "Hello? Hello?" After a long silence, he said quietly, calmly, "What happened? How come you didn't call?" She said, "I tried you at work, but you were out for lunch. You seemed so ambivalent about it anyway, and I got busy with something else." He felt angrier and angrier, and said she could have left a message. "Remember when you told me you'd make a good whore? But I don't think you would, because you're unreliable. Whores have to show up on time. When a whore makes an appointment, she has to be there. Or were you too drunk to remember we made a date? Maybe you don't remember what we said. You know, you and Jeremy are children. You're unreliable and play games, and you're out to hurt each other and do each other in, and you'll pull down anybody who's nearby." Then he said something about how she was just using him to get back at Jeremy. "Anyway, I'll see you sometime." And she said, "Don't hang up. Can't we get through this?" "Probably," he said, "but I don't feel like getting through it now." And he banged down the receiver and stood in the phone booth, feeling awful, wanting to talk to her again, feeling as if he'd said all the things he didn't want to say. He had to have some respect for her ambivalence, her reticence, her indecision, and unless he wanted to ruin what had happened between them and make it look cheap and stupid, he better call her back. Which he did. "Listen," he said, "you want to have breakfast? Let's go to Teacher's." "All right, give me 15 minutes to get dressed." He said okay, crossed the street, and went into Teacher's, a shishi West Side bar. He asked for a table in the back, and they sat down. They ordered Eggs Benedict, which they split. She had a club soda. He had a Bloody Mary. She ordered French fries, which he liked to eat with vinegar, English style. She was smoking Merritts. Then he took his sunglasses off, just looked at her, and she took her glasses off and looked at him. And he said, "Let's go back to my place. Will you come back with me?" She looked at him and nodded. Then she said, "But I have to go back to the house. I left the clothes in the dryer." He had the feeling if he didn't stay with her, he wouldn't see her again, ever. So he said, "Okay, I'll go back with you." When they arrived at her building by cab, he felt strange. He didn't want to come in. He said he'd wait downstairs in the lobby for her. He'd give her 5 minutes and no more. In 5 minutes, he went out and hailed a taxi and waited in it for what seemed an eternity, but was maybe 8 minutes, during which he became convinced she wouldn't come downstairs, that she was doing another number on him, and he began muttering to himself so that the cab driver could hear him. Women. Those bitches. Damn it. Finally, she came downstairs, got in the taxi, and they drove to his apartment, walked into the building past the doorman, and went up the elevator. It was 2 or 3 in the afternoon. They were at his door when he heard the lock of one of his neighbor's doors turning, and realized someone was going to come out and see him with her. So he rushed into his apartment and closed the door behind him in her face, leaving her in the hall alone. He assumed she'd know what to do, and heard her and another woman, his neighbor Estelle, exchange pleasantries, get on the elevator together, and go downstairs. Then it occurred to him she wouldn't come back. She'd just walk out. But 2 minutes later he heard the elevator door open again, and he opened the door, and there she was, giggling, and she came in. It was around 3 in the afternoon. They were sitting in the living room. She had a drink. They were smoking. She began talking again about whether or not she should go to Chicago, and the problem of her ambivalent relationship with Jeremy, who was away in Copenhagen. She repeated again that there was another reason she couldn't go to Chicago, and he said, "What's that?" "I don't know if I can tell you this," she said. He didn't ask her to tell him, or plead with her. He just sat there, figuring she wanted to, that he'd find out soon enough. And then she told him. She'd been sexually abused by her stepfather. It started when she was 2 or 3, and continued until she was about 11. He did everything to her, and nobody in the family knew. This had happened in Chicago, where she'd grown up. At least 2 or 3 times a week, at night, he'd go into her bedroom and play with her. He did it in such a way that she thought this was what fathers and daughters do, even when he was making love to her. And when she told him this, He flashed on the way it felt to make love to her, how much she was like a little girl, and how willing she was to please him. He had the feeling the story was hard for her to tell, but it was definitely not the first time she'd told it. It was kind of her tale. Finally, she told her mother what was going on, and it threw the whole family into a profound turmoil. The stepfather was thrown out of the house. She never saw him again, and it was then that they moved to Puerto Rico to change their lives, to get away. The reason she didn't want to go to Chicago was that she knew her stepfather was still there, and that he'd come looking for her, and she was terrified about what would happen if she saw him, because she was afraid she'd start with him again, and never be able to stop. Within 20 minutes they made love again, and this time he encouraged the father-daughter feeling that had been implied before, by the way he held her, the cuddling, the telling her what to do, because he knew her father had given her lots of instructions too. Sunday he went to pick up his wife at the airport, and he was so glad to see her. She looked so wonderful. They returned to the apartment. He changed the sheets, the pillowcases, all his clothes, but he was still hallucinating her perfume, and wondered if Barbara could smell it too. But she didn't, and that night Barbara and he made love, and he was more passionate and energized with her than he'd been in a long time. And for the next month or two, his sex life with his wife took a great leap forward, and she remarked on a number of occasions how attentive and loving he was. Maybe she should go away more often, she said. He saw her the following Monday at work. Jeremy was back in town. That night they went to a working-class bar. They were both wearing their glasses, smoking cigarettes. She had to go home to her boyfriend. He had to get back to his wife. And all of a sudden there was that tragic, it's over kind of feeling. We had our fling, and now it's the end. And they talked about getting out, just leaving. We'll take your credit card, and I'll take whatever cash I have left, he said, and we'll just go away together. She talked about all the beautiful places they could visit, and then she took off her glasses, and he took off his sunglasses, and they looked at each other eye to eye. They were playing something on the jukebox, and he asked, "Do you want to dance?" She nodded, and they stood up in the middle of this empty, funky bar with a couple of drunks watching the ball game on TV, and they danced very close for a minute or two. And he felt the same exhilaration and excitement, and sadness, loss, and frustration. And he looked at her and said, "You know, we had a whole love affair in 1 week. We met, we made love, we fought, we parted, we made up, and now it's over. And we did the whole thing in 6 days." When they sat down, she looked at him and said, "Are you okay? Are you all right?" They left the bar. He hailed a taxi for her, shook her hand, and she said, "We have a tradition, a custom in Latin America. When a man and woman say goodbye, they kiss." So he kissed her on both cheeks, and she got in the cab, and he got another powerful whiff of that perfume. But before she drove off, she said she and Jeremy were going down to Puerto Rico, that she was still trying to stall the Citibank people in Chicago, that since Jeremy had come back, it seemed nicer to her, though Jeremy had found the card in her purse in which he'd written yes or no about meeting for a drink, and she denied everything. Finally, he said, "Be sure to let me know what you decide to do." He didn't hear from her for about a week. He felt a sense of relief. Now he had to get her out of his system. But he found himself writing her name down over and over again on scraps of paper, and he went to the files at work, took out her folder with her original application and her resume and all the forms she'd filled out, and he looked at her signature, and he thought of how, when he first saw her, he'd had no interest in her, and she meant nothing to him, and now he thought he was in love with her. Everything she touched had a profound impact on him. Just a W-4 card with her address on it, written in her handwriting, like a little girl's, simple and shaky, and he thought he could smell her perfume, and imagined her eyes, and her body, and her hands. He tried to put her behind him. He wanted to have the emotional control to accept the fact it was over. A week later, he got a call at the office. and it was she. He closed the door, lifted the phone, and heard her husky cigarette voice. "Well, Jeremy has asked me to marry him." "I knew it. I absolutely knew it." "How did you know?" "The same way I knew the reason why you came to New York was a man, the way I've known everything about you." Then one afternoon she came by to pick up her last paycheck, and he took her back into his office. They both smoked cigarettes, and she told him that the night Jeremy said he'd marry her, they'd gone out to celebrate, and he'd gotten drunker than she'd ever seen him before. And when they got back to the apartment, it took her and 2 doormen to get him out of the cab and upstairs. That's how drunk he was. And as she told him this, tears began to fill her eyes, and she said she was terrified. They'd been in his office for a half hour. The room was filled with smoke. He realized it was time to say goodbye. He said, "Jeremy's kind of like your stepfather." And she nodded. His alcoholism, the importance of sex, the business suits. They looked at each other, took off their glasses, were both on the verge of tears, when he said, "Get out of here. Come on, stop, hurry up, leave this office now. Don't say anything else, don't do anything else, don't kiss me, just go, fast." He said it smiling, the way you might say, "Get out of here, you maniac, you knucklehead." She stood up. He held her in an awkward embrace, and then she was gone. He spoke to her one more time the following week. She called about some problem with a check, and then she said Jeremy wanted her to take the job at Citibank. He worked for a major stock brokerage firm, which could easily transfer him to Chicago. So they'd move there together. Wears a morning coat, striped pants, spats, white tie, attended by formally dressed best men. Their manner is grave and reserved, their motion slow and deliberate and purposeful. The bride, slender, in old lace, a long train of Victorian gossamer, her face veiled. The bridesmaids attend her in pastel gowns. One of the girls clutches a handkerchief in her left hand. The priest, in satin and broadcloth, a bishop's mitre on his head, the purple velvet surplice beneath his gown occasionally glinting in the filtered light of the stained glass windows, now reflecting purple, then red, then green, and now blue. He says, "Dearly beloved, heaven has brought together this couple for the purpose of holy matrimony. May their union be blessed and fruitful in the eyes of the Lord."